Hey there, this is Stives with Beard Logic, and this is episode 5 in the series where we build an adventure game. In the last episode, we were able to get the animation system up and running, literally and figuratively. So we're just going to pick up from where we left off. So we're going to make another trip back to Mixamo, and we're going to try and find a reasonable jump animation. We're going to be using this for when we're jumping and moving, so this animation here looks pretty good. And coming back into the Unity editor, we're just going to drop it in with our other animations. And for those of you who've been following along, the import's going to be very similar to what we've done before. However, we're going to be breaking this animation up a bit, so there's going to be a few more things we want to change compared to the other imports. The primary thing we're going to be looking at is the timeline, because we're not going to be using the entire animation all at once. As a reminder, our player controller is controlling our animation, so any root motion provided by the animation should ultimately be disabled, which means we're not going to be baking any of that into the animation itself, so all of the check marks are going to be left unchecked. So let's just quickly rename this clip jump, and here we'll adjust the timeline so that we're only going to get the initial part of the animation. The idea here is we don't want to be playing this animation over and over again, but we want to play sections of it depending on where we are in the process of jumping. So when we're initializing our jump and while we're going upward, we could try something like this. Now I'm just going to be doing two, one for jumping and one for falling, but ideally you'd add more depending on how sectioned off you want the animation to be. To make this a little more polished, for example, you could make a looping animation after you've released from your jump but while you're moving upward, or after you've reached the apex and going downward. I will likely be doing that in future episodes, but for now this I think will do quite nicely. And as you're seeing, I'm just working on the fall animation, which is quite literally the opposite of the animation we just did. This animation will be triggered when the character goes into the fall state initially, and won't look the greatest because it's going to have a set end time, but once again, we can improve upon that later on. Alright, let's go back to the animator window, and we should still see our player animation controller set up here. So for each state that we have that the character can now be in, we're going to make a new node in the graph. So we already have the one for move, so what we need to do is create one for jump and one for fall. We want each of these nodes to be accessible from any point in the animation state, so we're going to create a state transition from any state to each of the nodes. When setting up these transitions, we need a parameter to determine when they should be allowed to go into those states, and we also need to know which state it needs to go into. In the last video, we added and set up the transition trigger, which will tell the state machine when to transition. So on each of these paths, we set the conditions, one as transition, so that when that's true, it will go, and then we set the other one to the index of the animation that we want it to go into. As you recall, we set the enumerators in code so that each of them had an index, and that's what I'm using here. So jump was 1, and move standard was 0, fall was 5, etc. And as you can see, I renamed the state so that I wouldn't have any trouble remembering which index went to which one. So I'm just going to finish up by assigning the rest of the conditions to each of the transitions here. And then we can try it out. So we can see that we're going into the jump animation okay. And then it just sort of pauses at the end, which is what I would expect because I don't have the animation looping. However, it doesn't look like we're going into the fall animation at all. And after admittedly far too much time trying to figure out exactly what went wrong there, I eventually figured out that there was a state that I neglected to add an animation for. So I'm going to be adding another animation, the crouch animation, for when you're initializing the jump. Quick trip back to Mixamo, and we've got ourselves a crouch animation. Let's get this animation into Unity and set it up as we have with the others. I was checking off the bake into pose option for the animation, but really we don't need that, so you can sort of ignore that. It doesn't really make much of a difference in this case because the animation doesn't have any movement to it, so we don't have to really worry about it. Looping's a good one to have on though. So let's drag the new crouch animation in here. And what we're going to do is replace the jump animation with the crouch animation, and the jump is going to become our flight animation. So crouch is going to be 1, I believe, on index, and flight is going to be 4. If you're unsure, you can always go back to the enumerator and see which value we've assigned to each state. And here I'm just setting up the crouch node's transition to be exactly like all of the others, except it's going to be going to index 1. And I think with all that done, we should probably have our jump working now. Okay, well that's looking much better. Alright, well now that we've got that working, something we sort of ran out of time for last episode was getting the walk working. So all we're really going to do here is add the control to allow the character to either walk or run depending on the player input. So I think what we're going to do is add a parameter called run requested, and each update frame we're going to check to see if the shift key is down, and if it is, we're going to assume that the player wants the character to run. For that, we're going to need two different movement speeds. Instead of just this one, we'll break it into a walk speed and a run speed. This is the basic setup. We'll add the walk and run speed here in a second. Since we're replacing the movement speed, I'll just rename it to run speed. Then we just need to add the walk speed and replace the reference down below. There we go. Let's test her out. So we got that working now, but as you can see, the walk animation does not sync up with the movement speed of the character. So this may be overkill, but let's add an animation curve that determines the speed that the animation will play based on the speed the character is moving. I say this is overkill because we could really just use two values, one for walking and one for running. But if you wanted to add acceleration or deceleration to your character movement, then you'd probably need something like this anyway, so I figure I'll do it this way. And it's reasonably easy to set up. Really, we're just taking one value that goes from 0 to 1 and changing it to a different value that goes from 0 to 1. So we just need to do something like this. So now all we really need to do is find the curve that works for us. So the input value on the x-axis is the speed the character is moving. And the output value on the y-axis is the speed that the animation is going to play. So at the top we have 1, 1, so we're going to be running at full speed when the animation is going at full speed, which seems to be accurate from what we were seeing. And down at the origins at 0, 0 there, we're not going to be moving at all. And after a bit of playing around, I ended up settling on this curve here. So if I decided that I wanted to add acceleration or deceleration to the character, this curve would probably have to change a bit. But for this purpose, it's working pretty well. Okay, to round out this video, I think I'm going to do a little bit more work on the jump animations. Right now it's looking a little rigid, and I think I want to try a different animation for the jump. And I'm not even sure if the fall state is being triggered right now, so we should have a look at that really quickly too. Okay, so the first thing is, if you look at how the character is starting the jump, it takes a long time for the character to get into the crouch position, so it seems like a really unnatural jump. So I think all we really have to do there is increase the transition speed to get into that crouch position. So let's bring that transition duration down a bit. You could try, instead of 0.25, try 0.1 or 0.15. I think that should work out quite a bit better. And there's a pretty big improvement there already. I like that. So let's have a look at the, I guess you'd call it the flight animation that we're using. So I'm finding having the legs apart like that while we're jumping seems a little awkward. So I think we're just going to adjust the end of the animation so that the legs are together, and so it's going to start falling. But remember, that doesn't matter because the motion's not controlled by the animation. Now make sure that you disable the loop time, because I added that because I was just messing around. But other than that, let's give that a shot. So that's looking quite a bit more natural now, I would say. I'll still likely spend a bit of time tweaking parameters in the animator, particularly the transition speeds to go into each of the states. But as always with this sort of thing, if it feels right to you, then just leave it as it is. So another thing that I'm pretty sure is going to be causing problems is, based on what I was seeing in the log, we're not actually running into the fall state at all. So it looks like this is probably the problem here. So because we're resetting the velocity and not the rigid body velocity, this should probably work fine. There we have it. The fall state is actually being called right now. I think I'm going to tweak that animation a bit though. I might even download another fall animation to make it look a little nicer. We'll see. But I think I'll leave that up to you and your projects to mess with. So I think that's going to be it for this video. We'll likely be doing more animations in the videos to come. but I would like to get to the wall grab at some point, so we'll see what happens. Thank you all for taking an interest in this series. At this point, I'm pretty committed to continuing this series, thanks to you. So if you would like to see anything in particular on movement for these particular games, let me know, and I'll see what I can do. Bye for now.